Hey everyone, and welcome along to today's webinar. Today we're going to be talking about CI/CD with GitHub Actions and Octopus Deploy. And shortly I'll also be joined by Chris Reddington, who is a cloud solutions architect over at Microsoft. I'm really excited about this talk actually because it's some really interesting demos that we'll get into in the not too distant future. So before we do that, though, we've got a little bit of housekeeping that I'd like to talk about. You won't need to record today's recording. We'll do that job for you. And then shortly after the event, we'll send out an email with a link to it. So you can go and watch it again at your leisure over there on YouTube. Onwards from that, we absolutely want you to submit some questions, be part of the conversation. You can do that either here in the Zoom Q&A, and please do that over using the messages function because that allows us to be able to orchestrate the answering of those questions in a better way. Alternatively, you can join us in our community over in octopus.com/Slack. And if you go to the webinar channel in there, you can also ask your questions there too. So yeah, absolutely do that. And at the end of this webinar, we'll spend some time going through them. So we look forward to doing that. And at this point, I'm going to bring in my good friend, Chris Reddington. Chris, how's things?
Hey, Pete, I'm good, thank you. Thanks for having me. How are you doing?
Yeah, good. I'm really excited about the webinar we're giving today because certainly to be able to integrate something like GitHub Actions and Octopus Deploy really shows a great story of how powerful that process can be.
Mhm.
Before we get into that, Chris, I know you're a cloud solutions architect over at Microsoft. Did you want to explain a little bit more about your day-to-day?
Yeah, sure, because I guess our interactions are mainly tech community focused, aren't they? So, Chris Reddington, Cloud Solution Architect at Microsoft in the Digital and Application Innovation area. Effectively, what that means is things like Azure, things like Power Platform, Visual Studio, and GitHub are all the types of things that I care about and I work on day to day with customers. So lots of exciting areas, lots of exciting projects to work on, and really keeps me focused on the development space. Really exciting place to be.
I like that. And actually, listening to you explain your day to day, it kind of mirrors in some ways what I do here at Octopus
Mm,
Deploy as well. And I love this particular job because there's something new almost every single day, and I'm
that's
kind of
it.
like that. And it's shiny, very much. So yeah, very much shiny. So I like that. It's good.
Always
So
learning.
yeah. So on the agenda today, the first thing we're going to talk about, of course, is GitHub. So I'll know that Chris, you are going to be the person that's going to be introducing us to GitHub and how we can go about using the various facets of GitHub to be able to integrate then with our whole CI/CD pipeline. So
Mhm.
that's going to be interesting. So that'll be Chris's section. That will include some really nice demos after Chris has done some slides. Where we'll be able to demonstrate the power of that platform and integrating with Octopus Deploy. Once we've gone through the demos, we'll cycle back and we'll have a short recap of what it is that we've gone through and the learning that you can take away from that. And then finally, we'll have a section of Q&A at the end. And again, do please ask your questions either here in the Zoom Q&A function or across on our community Slack in the webinar channel. And we'll spend some time in that Q&A section going through your questions and trying to make sure that you can take away as much information as possible from today. So at that point, Chris, I think I'll hand the floor over to you and let you do some explanation around GitHub. So thank you very much.
Awesome. Thank you, Pete. Excellent. So, firstly, thank you again for having me, and glad to be speaking with you all here today. Where I want to start our discussion really is making sure that everyone's got the same foundation of understanding around GitHub, what it is, its capabilities, because I appreciate there's probably a lot of different personas and backgrounds that we've got here. So you might be a developer, you might be more of an ops person, you might be completely unrelated, you might even have used GitHub in your day to day, maybe you haven't. So what I want to do is just first level set with everyone and make sure that we're all on the same page. So GitHub. Probably, if I say the word open source, your next thought is probably GitHub, almost intrinsically or inherently. GitHub is really the home for a lot of developers and for a lot of open source contributions. When you think about things like Kubernetes, for example, which is, of course, a very hot topic in the industry these days, Kubernetes is an open source project. And Kubernetes, the code base for that, the collaboration, all of the work that happens on that, happens on GitHub. And the beauty of that is there's this big open source community that is building and developing and growing on GitHub. And actually, a lot of that really blends into the day to day of what we might do in our development jobs in companies. Because there's a flavor of GitHub called GitHub Enterprise, and we can use those same tools, those same capabilities for our day to day work as well. And that's a really important aspect just to lean in on, because I talk about our day to day work. Day to day work for developers and anyone who's working with code in any way. So if you're an IT professional, you'll probably have some of your PowerShell scripts or your Bash scripts, for example, or your infrastructure as code, perhaps. Data scientists might have your machine learning workbooks, etc. We all need to store that code somewhere. And a lot of people still think about GitHub as this kind of version control repository, this place where you store your code. But actually, GitHub is so much more than just a place where you can go and store your code. So if you look at this diagram on the screen here in the middle, development starts with a plan. You need to understand what you're working towards, what are your features, what your users want. You then go and code it out, you go and build it, you test it, you release it, deploy, operate, and ultimately monitor it, and keep going round and round that DevOps lifecycle. Now, GitHub, a lot of people seem to still think that GitHub is all about the just version control, the Git side of things, so that kind of code layer there that we see. But actually, it's so much more. It's all about helping you with that end-to-end development lifecycle, taking your code from being code and deploying it into some kind of platform. And a lot of those platforms are typically cloud, from what we see working with customers. There may be some on-premises, there may be some AWS, some Azure, some GCP. But ultimately, the destination doesn't matter. As long as you can go ahead and write on the command line, for example, some steps that you can go and do to take that raw code and convert it into something which can be deployed as a package, or maybe GitHub Actions, for example, we'll cover a bit later. Taking that and pushing that out as an artifact effectively is something then that you can either use GitHub directly for or integrate with great tools such as Octopus Deploy, which is what we'll be talking about here today. Now, the first area that I just want to dig into here before we jump into demos is something called GitHub Codespaces. Now, the thing about GitHub for me is there's quite a lot of innovation happening with GitHub and with the features and the services that are available. So I'm going to give you a scenario here. Think of those times where you've joined a new project. Maybe it's transferring teams inside your company. Maybe you're a contractor and you're contracting for a new organization. Maybe you've joined a new organization as an employee. You need to get your development machine set up. If you're lucky, the team has a set of scripted steps and they can go and install the components quite easily there because it's well documented. If you're lucky, that might take a few hours. It might take a day. If you're unlucky, there's no documentation and it takes you maybe a week or even longer. That setup experience of getting going and being productive is really important, because even if I'm not a new developer and I've been at the company for a while and I need to reset my machine for whatever reason, that time to productivity is super, super important. And this is something where GitHub Codespaces can go and help us out here. Imagine that in your repository, you could have a definition to go and describe what you want your development environment to go and look like. And then you could just go ahead and create that development environment on demand as you need it. That is exactly what GitHub Codespaces is there to do, is to help make that ability to create that development environment really simple, really consistent, so that onboarding new team members or making sure you can be productive happens really quickly. And we'll take a look at that through the demos here as well today. Another aspect we'll talk a lot about is GitHub Actions. Now, we'll be focusing about GitHub Actions in the context of continuous integration and continuous deployment or delivery, so CI/CD. But GitHub Actions is so much more than that. Effectively, it's an event-based platform. So if you think about something like an open source project, on an open source project, people are going to be raising issues for new feature requests, for bugs. Maybe you've got a great community where there's a lot of discussion happening. So you have GitHub discussions, which are like forums effectively, or you can have some Q&A. All of that is going to take time for an open source maintainer. And again, you can translate those same concepts to an inner source model inside of an enterprise as well. But all of those efforts take time. Wouldn't it be great if you could actually go and react to maybe someone's first contribution to a project, or if they've put a certain flag in a pull request, for example? Wouldn't it be great if you could just automatically respond to that? GitHub Actions can help us do exactly that. So it's more than just CI/CD. It's a really, really powerful platform. Now, of course, there's several GitHub Actions available for Azure, which is where I typically focus. But again, as we talked about earlier, there's so much more. You've got actions out there for AWS, GCP, and of course, Octopus Deploy that we'll be talking about a little bit later here as well. And it's any platform. So the example demo that we'll go through today will be running on a Linux machine. Yes, you could run Windows. Yes, you could run macOS as well. And you could even self-host those. Those operating systems I mentioned are the ones available as GitHub hosted agents there. So lots of capabilities there for you to go and try. But the beauty for me in GitHub Actions is really this open source ecosystem that it builds upon. I won't spoil that too much yet. We'll take a look in the demo a little bit later because I think there's some great examples of how it builds on top of open source. But ultimately, a growing platform. I think in August 2019, there's been a 5 times increase since August 2019, and there's now 2,500 actions or more available in the GitHub marketplace.
And coming in at that point, Chris, actually you make a really good point. The marketplace is one of my favourite parts of GitHub Actions, and it lends an openness to the whole platform to allow an integration between obviously what GitHub have done with GitHub Actions and then what other products are achieving with what they're doing. Obviously, with that, there could be some overlap between a couple of different products. Is that something that you see when you're using GitHub Actions?
Yeah. I mean, if we move away from the Octopus Deploy side and the release side for a moment and think about secrets, I've got things like Azure Key Vault, I've got HashiCorp Vault, I've got secrets in my GitHub repository as well. There's always a number of different options, right? And I think you're going to be coming from a certain place already, like you might already be using HashiCorp Vault. If I'm using HashiCorp Vault, am I going to want to manually put all of my secrets directly in to my GitHub repository to use them that way? Probably not. What I'd rather is being able to go and download those secrets in my GitHub action workflow by using a download secrets action from the HashiCorp team, for example. And I think that's the beauty of GitHub Actions, is it's not mandating one way to go and do things. As you say, there's plenty of providers, plenty of different tools and options out there that you can go and use their actions and go and use those capabilities then.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, something that comes to mind immediately is the sort of the push mechanism that GitHub Actions is using to deploy things out. It could be that doesn't work for your particular workflow.
Yes.
And here at Octopus Deploy, we've got the concept of tentacles that will listen, so listening tentacles, and we can use those to be able to work with that particular part of the pipeline. And obviously, the subject matter of today is how we can use essentially the CI part of GitHub Actions which is super powerful, and then be able to use those actions in the marketplace to be able to interface out to Octopus Deploy to achieve the CD part, the deployment part of that pipeline. So that's one of the reasons I love GitHub Actions is the openness of the platform. So
yeah, fully agree. And I think a lot of the people listening to this webinar are either going to be existing Octopus Deploy customers who have that existing investment, so probably won't want to move away from that, and they might be prospective customers who are already evaluating it for their needs, feel that it's the right product, and again, there's no reason why you can't use that as part of the GitHub Action workflow there.
Yeah, make the products work the way that you need.
Right.
It's super powerful. Thanks for that, Chris.
Yeah, sure. If we think about development lifecycle all up, there's this theme that we're seeing in the industry, the importance of security. Security is something which is all of our responsibilities, and it's something that shouldn't be an afterthought. It's something that needs to be part of our development lifecycle and part of what we do on a day-to-day basis. And this is where GitHub Advanced Security comes in. It's a great offering. It's one of those features that I think is one of my favorites in GitHub actually at the moment. And there's a number of different areas where it can help you. So think about, for example, managing dependencies. If you've got your project you're working on, how do you know if you've got a dependency which is old? Or how do you know if you've got a critical vulnerability in one of those dependencies, for example? No one likes to go managing stuff like that. We just want to create new shiny features. So there's a feature called Dependable, which can help you manage that and maintain those and keep those up to date through pull requests. Another great feature is secret scanning. You don't want to leak any of your secrets because obviously bad things then happen if they leak out. Secret scanning is a capability available as well. But one of the really interesting and cool ones is code scanning that you can see on screen here. And there's a capability called CodeQL, and this gives a little bit of a hint of what this capability is. Imagine that you could take your code base and deconstruct it into a database. And imagine that I could write some code where I could go and query across that code base and say, right, if we call this controller, pass in this model, pass in this input, down this particular code path, and these things all happen, what happens? Is there a potential vulnerability? And what that allows you to do is search for typical patterns that might be in your code base. So say an unsanitized input. Have you sanitized that anywhere along the code path? Or are you potentially open to a SQL injection attack, for example? That is the power of CodeQL and the power of this kind of capability, which you can integrate into your development lifecycle. We're not going to have a chance to talk about it today, but it is something that I really wanted to bring in here because I think it's super, super important with the climate of the world that we're living in today and the importance of security. So with that, that's all the slides I wanted to cover. So let's go ahead, jump over to GitHub and actually go and take a look at some demos. So you can see here that I have my GitHub repository, Chris Reddington Octopet Shop, and this is just a fork from the Octopus Deploy community Octopet Shop repository. So this is one which is available for samples and demos from the Octopus Deploy team. You can see here that I've got a GitHub repository. It just looks like any other kind of file system or Git repository here. I can see a number of different folders, a number of different files, etc. going on. And let's say I'm about to go and start my development for the day. I want to change my Octopet Shop example here. Now, I might come ahead, for example, and go into my web folder here. I might go ahead, look at my views, go into my home and start looking and thinking, right, you know what? I need to make a change to my index page. I need to go and update what is available there for my users. Now, I could go and click edit in GitHub right here against that file. But wouldn't it be great if I could actually go and use something like Visual Studio Code? Well, again, like we talked about earlier, I could go and download Visual Studio Code, Visual Studio, all the dependencies I need to go and build that project and test locally, etc. Or I could go ahead and use something like GitHub Codespaces. And the way that I can do that is, you see I've got this kind of green button here on my repository for code. And I've got two options. I can either clone my repository locally, or I can use Codespaces. So I can just click on this existing Codespace that I've created previously. What it will do is it will spin that up for me. And now you can see I'm in GitHub Codespaces there. Now, just to prove to you that I'm actually still in a web browser, I'm not running Visual Studio Code right now, you can see my web address right up here. And this looks and feels exactly like Visual Studio Code. It's just GitHub Codespaces. So what's happening behind the scenes here is a container is spun up. It's got some dependencies and things installed. And what I can do to make that process even more refined is I can use a definition file called a dev container.json and specify what extensions I want to be installed, what binaries or dependencies I want to be installed as well ahead of time, so that as soon as this environment is online, I can be productive. You can see I've got my terminal. You can see I've got my extensions that I use locally, and it's synced those with VS Code. So it's a really nice environment to work in here. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead, find that view again that I was going to update. So here's my index file, and I'm going to make a new change here, and I'm going to say, you know what, we'd love GitHub and GitHub Actions and Codespaces. Let's just do that. There we go. There we go. Perfect. So that passes the quality bar there in terms of the change that we want to go and make. So now what we're going to do is we're going to commit that code, but we know committing code to the main branch is not a good pattern. So we're going to go and create a new branch here, and we're just going to call that something like GitHub Actions Demo. Very creative and inventive name there, I know. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to go ahead and say updating the index message, something like that. We'll go and commit that, and we'll publish that to my origin, which is my repository there. And you can see on the bottom right of the screen there, I've got this pop-up which has said, hey, we can see that you've pushed this code into a new branch. Do you want to create a pull request here? So I'm going to create a pull request. And I can see that it's asking me to merge my changes from the branch that I just created into this repository, which is the wrong repository. That's the upstream, so the one from Octopus Deploy. So I just need to change that to my fork. And then I can go and make sure that I want to merge it into main there. And then I can update the title of the pull request. So I'll say something like update the index page to include GitHub messages that we love. There we go. And I could create, put some text in the description there as well. But for now, we're just going to go and hit create there. And what I can see right inside my GitHub Codespace here is the pull request that we've just created. Now I could click the link, which will take us right back into GitHub here. And you can see now I've got that pull request underneath my repository. Now, if I just scroll down, we can see, like we would with any pull request, the commits that's gone on there, the files that have been changed, for example. But if I jump back to the conversation and just scroll down a little bit, what you'll see here is there's this kind of status check thing going on. And I can see there's this .NET Core build/build, and it's in progress. So let's go click on that, because what's actually going on here? And you can see suddenly I jump on this page, and now there's a load of logs outputting here. There's a load of steps happening. What is actually going on here? Well, if I just scroll back up to the top of my repository here, go to code, and I'm just going to show you this directory once again. Notice that I've got this .github/workflows folder here. I'm going to click on that, And you can see that I've got these 3 YAML files: .NET Core Build, .NET Core Local, and .NET Core NuGet. So I'm just going to click on this .NET Core Build YAML file here. I'll just zoom in a bit just to make sure that's super clear and readable here for you all. So you can see here that we've given that workflow file a name, and this is really the definition of our GitHub Actions workflow file. This is exactly what we're saying. So you can see that I've got a trigger here, and that is effectively describing when should this workflow run, when should it execute. So you can see there's 2 different triggers. The first one being on a pull request to our main branch, and the second one being on a workflow dispatch, which is effectively a way of saying on a manual trigger, clicking a button and clicking run. Now, the reason this workflow has executed for us is because of this trigger. We created the pull request, and we targeted that pull request to merge into the main branch. So as a result, this GitHub Actions workflow is now triggering. Now, if I scroll down, you can see that I can have a number of jobs. So we've only got the 1 job in this example workflow here called build. And we can see here that this job runs on Ubuntu latest. And remember, we've got Mac, we've got Ubuntu, and we've got Windows that we can run on from the GitHub hosted runners. But I could install an agent on my own local PC or on my servers in my cloud environment if I wanted to go and run agents there as well. And then we have a series of steps, almost the recipe, if you like, or the series of actions that need to be followed here. Now, Pete, I didn't pre-warn you for this one, so prepare yourself here. Pop quiz time.
Oh, no. And I didn't do any revision or write anything down.
So, look at this definition right here that you see on line 16. You see actions/checkout. Do you notice anything interesting about that naming convention?
Yeah, I mean, it kind of looks like a folder structure, or perhaps at the end of a URL, or I don't know. It looks like it wants to be clicked on almost.
So what I'm going to do is I'm going to copy that, and I'm just going to open a new tab here, type github.com, and just paste in that line there. And what you'll see, if I just zoom out ever so slightly, it's just another GitHub repository.
Awesome.
And that is what I meant a bit earlier around the beauty of GitHub Actions and building on the open source community. This is a repo which is managed by the GitHub team, for example, but I could create my own repository, which is a GitHub action, which anyone could go and use. So remember that it had like the @v2 thing at the end of the line as well? Well, that maps to these releases here in the code base as well. So we can see the latest is v3.02, but if we scroll down, if I go actually to the releases rather than a specific one, we can see there's a number of different releases that have been created. So somewhere in here, one of those will be tagged with v2. So that will be the version of the repository I'm using for that GitHub action in my workflow file. Now, if I zoom back in again, there's a few other interesting pieces. So yes, I can use these GitHub actions, which are just other GitHub repositories effectively, and these kind of reusable set of steps. But I can also go and run command line as well. So you can see this one, we're just echoing package_version as a variable. We're outputting the date there, the GitHub run number, which is an environment variable, and outputting that to the GitHub env variable. You can see we just set up .NET 6. We use this action/setup.net, which is again another GitHub action. And that one is just a separate repository once again. And there's a v1 of that one. Now we pass in some properties. This is kind of the convention to pass in properties to your GitHub actions there using this with command here. And we can see we're specifying we're going to use .NET 6 there. And then what we do at this point is we just do the usual things we would do to build, test, restore, and generate the needed artifacts for our .NET application. So we restore the NuGet packages that we need. We then go and build that application ready for release. We go and test the application just to make sure our unit tests or our integration tests work. And then we create a series of folders. And those folders are just ready just to make it a little bit clean when we generate our artifacts a little bit later. And then we have a series of steps here that go and run .NET Publish. So we've got several components in the Octo Pet Shop example here. So we've got the database, we've got the Pet Shop web, we've got the Pet Shop product service here as well. So each of these is like a different microservice or component, if you want to think about it that way. So each of them has their own artifact, which is generated as a result using .NET Publish. And then what I can do is I can keep scrolling down here. And this is where we start getting to the Octopus deploy aspects with GitHub Actions. So you can notice here that we're once again using a GitHub action. And this GitHub action installs the Octopus CLI onto the GitHub action runner, or the agent, if you want to think about it that way, that is currently executing. So basically, make sure that the Octopus CLI is installed and running with the latest version. And then from there, what we can do is run a series of steps using that Octopus deploy CLI to use things like Octopack. So go and pack up those various artifacts that we had. So pack up the database, the shop web, the product service, the cart service, and then go and push those. So notice that the Octopack is running on the command line. We downloaded the CLI using an action, and we also can push the package to Octopus deploy using an action as well. To do that, once again, we have this with property here, and we specify some properties here: an API key, a server, packages, space, etc. But of course, something like an API key is not something we want to hold in our source control, not in our code base. So what we can do is we can reference the secrets from inside GitHub Actions. It's really simple to go and do that. If I just scroll up back to the top here, hit my settings, we'll get a new tab. I can go to secrets, to actions, and you can see that I have these 3 repository secrets defined right here. So they're not in code, they're held securely, and that's how then they are referenced in the workflow file. And then ultimately, once we've pushed those packages, we can go ahead there and use the Octopus deploy CLI once again to go and create that release and then deploy that release then there as well. So you can see it's a very logical workflow and set of steps there to go and use GitHub Actions to work with Octopus deploy. So Pete, given there's a fair bit of Octopus deploy stuff happening there, did you maybe want to expand what's actually happening on that side?
Yeah, absolutely. And that was really good, really interesting stuff there that you've demoed. If we switch across to my screen, there we go. So I'm actually looking at that same GitHub action that Chris was running through the details of earlier, and we can actually see that's completed now successfully, which is nice. Chris went through in quite a lot of detail about all of these, but we can see the Octopus deploy stuff happens around this step here, where we're packing up our various different sections to the Octo Pet Shop app. So we're packing up the web app here and the product service and the shopping cart service. And then at that point, we're able to push our packages to a place where Octopus deploy can access them. And these are the artifacts then that we'll then use as the rest of our deploy process. So you can see here that we calculate some deltas, and then we push a package out to a location that we're able to then use in our Octopus deploy process. Next, we then create the release over in Octopus deploy. Again, we're going to be using the Octo command line here, so we can create a release at that point. And then once the release is created, and you can see there's quite a bit that happens during that process, then we can deploy that release then and get that process kicked off. So with that all completed successfully in GitHub Actions, it's worth a while having a look and seeing what's actually happening over in Octopus deploy. It's worth noting that, I mean, Chris mentioned that there are a plethora of community GitHub actions available for folks to be able to use. And here's some of the Octopus deploy ones that are available. So we can see we can run a runbook or push a package or install the Octopus CLI and create a release. And you can see we're using some of those in our release process, in our CI process there in GitHub Actions. So let's have a look at Octopus deploy and see what's happening. And we can see here that we've got a release. So on this first line here, we can see that it's actually stopped at the moment. And what it's doing is waiting for a manual intervention to occur. Before I dive into what this has done under the hood here, I'm going to take you through the actual process in a little bit, just so that you can see what's actually happened. But just before I do that, actually, if we return to our action, Chris mentioned during this that we're grabbing things like a space ID and an API key, and we can grab those quite easily from Octopus Deploy as well. Our space ID, the easiest place to find that would be just to use the URL, and we can see that space is 403. And your API key, you can grab from the profile and create yourself an API key from in there as well. So they're kind of the main parts that you're going to need along with the project, the Octo Pet Shop project. So if we go into the process for our Octo Pet Shop, we can see that there's a few steps that this goes through. And actually, we're going to be deploying only to the test environment for this particular demo. So what we've got here is that the first thing it's going to do is create the infrastructure that we're going to deploy our test project to. So this is actually a runbook, as it happens. So if I scroll down and we go to runbooks, we can see we've got two runbooks here. The first is create infrastructure and the second is destroy infrastructure. This is a really great idea for just testing. So what we can do is we can spin up that test environment, deploy our testing code to that, make sure that everything passes as far as our own internal testing regime dictates. And then at that point, we can destroy the infrastructure afterwards. That way, we're only spinning up the test infrastructure while we need it, instead of leaving it spinning, consuming credits. If we dive into that briefly, we can have a look at the process, where we create a resource group and a SQL Server, because this is going to be a SQL Server-backed application, an empty database, an app service plan to be able to hold the various tiers of our multi-tier application, the product service, the shopping cart service, and the web app. We register all of those, and then we're able to deploy to it. This is actually using something called dynamic infrastructure here, where we can create the infrastructure on the fly and then use that dynamically within Octopus Deploy to be able to deploy our testing code too. So if we go back to our deploy process again, we can see once we've spun the create infrastructure runbook through, now we've got our infrastructure, we just need to do a health check on that to make sure that everything is ready for us to be able to deploy our code to. At that point, if we are in production, we've got a manual intervention step. We're not going to be deploying to production, so that's not going to happen for us. And then next, we deploy the web app, the product service app, and the shopping cart service web apps out, along with the database. And then actually we print out a URL so that we can easily click on that and go and have a look at the result of our application running. Finally, after that, then we wait for a manual intervention to be accepted. And after that manual intervention has been accepted, we've gone through all of our testing, we're happy with what we've done, we can then destroy the infrastructure afterwards. So actually, if we go across now and have a look at what our release has done, if we click into this release, you'll see it's actually asking me to assign that manual intervention task to myself to be able to approve it. But the last thing we want to do is that now, because if I do that, I can't show you what it's actually deployed. So if I scroll down a little bit further, we can see the various steps are completed successfully. And here we have the printout URL step. And if I click on that, it will open us a new tab. And there we have it. There's our Octo Pet Shop application. And this is our testing code. And we can actually see here the new line that Chris has added. So we love GitHub and GitHub Actions and code spaces. And I absolutely agree. We can go ahead. This is a fully functioning application at this point. We can add an item to the cart and submit. And then finish, and we can see that that's all working. So we can go through our testing process now, approve all of the changes we've made, and then if it's all okay, we can destroy the testing infrastructure and approve that PR, merge it into our main, and deploy that out into production. So that's super powerful. If I flick across to VS Code, so I'm running VS Code locally here, whereas of course Chris was using VS Code over there in the browser, which is fantastic. We'll be able to see here that same build process, that same GitHub action process in my browser. And of course, scrolling down to the bottom, we can still see that same information that we need: the API key, the server, the packages, and the space. All of this you can then define, as I've mentioned there, grab those bits and then set them up as secrets in your GitHub repo. Something else to bear in mind is that if we flick back to our Octopus deploy instance here, at the bottom here, we've got version control. If I click on that, we can see that I've actually linked this directly to the Git repository. Now, what we're doing here is we're utilizing something called config as code. And this is a new feature that we've introduced in Octopus Deploy that we're really proud of, that gives you the facility to define your deployment process in code directly. So if we go across to VS Code and I open up the list of files, you can see here we've got a .octopus folder. And if I expand that, we've got some files in there, and one of them is our actual deployment process. So if we click into this deployment process, we can see that we've got those same steps that I demonstrated to you earlier. So we've got that create infrastructure for test runbook that we're running, and the runbook variables that go along with that. Next, we've got the health check step. Onwards from that, we've got the manual intervention required production step. We can see here on line 52 that that's where we're setting that it's only running for production. Onwards from that, we're deploying our web app and our product service web app and our shopping cart service web app and also our database. And then we're printing out the URL. And you can see here that we're able to run inline scripts at this point to be able to print out things like the URL that are really useful to us. What's really useful is if you combine VS Code at this point with the Octopus Deploy extension. If you go ahead and search in the extensions for VS Code, you'll find our Octopus Deploy extension. And what that does is, and it's described here in a little bit of detail at the bottom, is give you syntax highlighting for our OCL file. If you were to open this directly in GitHub, of course, everything would be white. So that syntax highlighting I found to be super powerful. It really does, it separates everything out and makes it more human readable. We're using an extension called OCL here, which is our Octopus configuration language, which is taken as a branch away from the HCL version, the HashiCorp version of configuration language. We did look at other options, even including XML, which I'm glad we've settled on OCL as the configuration language that we use for this. Onwards from this, actually, to make this even more legible, because these processes can get quite lengthy, and as you can see, scrolling through that file can get a bit cumbersome. If I click on the little octopus icon in our toolbox there, then we can pop out a tree view of that process, and we can scroll through that and see what each of these do at a glance in the tree view, which is really powerful. So I can go down to what the start trigger is for our product service deployment step, or right to the bottom to destroying our infrastructure. So that gives you some idea of how we can integrate various different facets of GitHub and GitHub Actions and code spaces, and also our config as code functionality here in Octopus as well, to be able to flesh out a really powerful CI/CD pipeline. And if I bring Chris back in at this point, Chris, I mean, what's obvious when we go through this is that there's a really great integration story between GitHub and GitHub Actions and Octopus Deploy and config as code. I was wondering if you had any thoughts on that.
No, just to completely echo what you say. I think you've got this great integration, as you say, between the two. The fact that you've got something like GitHub, which many people are familiar with because of open source contributions, etc. You can store your code up there, trigger some of that automation to begin based on the fact you've done a check-in or a pull request. It begins automating some of that monotonous kind of work that maybe, I don't want to go and build again, have to go through that dev lifecycle again. Instead, it's just something which just happens by virtue and nature of being on the platform, and the fact you can then integrate so nicely into something like Octopus Deploy, go and trigger that, and I've probably got my existing investments in Octopus Deploy. Be able to go and just release that and push that out using those mechanisms is fantastic. So just echoing what you said there, Pete.
Yeah, no, I agree. Yeah, I think I've really enjoyed that process to be able to go through that. I think it's really powerful. So at this point, if we go through a bit of a recap of what we've spoken about, actually, Chris, if you'd like to talk about the GitHub side of that, then I'll talk about the Octopus stuff afterwards.
Sure, of course. So we began talking about GitHub, just a bit of a level set that GitHub, primarily a lot of people think about it from an open source perspective, but of course you could use it for your own internal organization's work as well from an enterprise perspective. And there are some great innovative features coming there. So things like GitHub code spaces, being able to spin up that development environment quickly and easily to be productive, using things like GitHub Actions and being able to go and trigger not just CI/CD kind of workloads, but based on a number of GitHub events. And then things like GitHub Advanced Security that we didn't have a chance to look at today. But again, lots of great features coming there from things like Dependabot, CodeQL, secret scanning, and being able to help you strengthen that overall security posture as you integrate that into your development lifecycle. It's not an afterthought. It's all of our problems, and it's something we need to bring in directly into that life cycle. So then we went through the demos. We did a pull request using GitHub code spaces, added the text to that index page, which then, of course, because we raised a pull request, it then triggered the GitHub action and the workflow that we had there, which built our application, it compiled it, and then it went ahead, packaged it up, and sent that across to Octopus Deploy.
Awesome. Yeah, that was really good. Obviously, at that point, I just reiterated some of the steps that Chris had been through to show you how the integration happens at that point, the steps that we can take to be able to package up our artifacts and then store them somewhere where our Octopus Deploy process can use them. And then onwards from that, we're able to create and deploy the releases. Then I was able to show you then the process that we go through after that to be able to create our infrastructure and deploy out the various artifacts that we'd created in the GitHub action. And then there was a manual intervention step that left it at that point, and we could see the result in our browser and perhaps go through our testing process before then approving the manual intervention step and destroying the infrastructure and the rest of your process after that. We also had a quick look at how we can use the new config as code functionality in Octopus Deploy to be able to further use GitHub so that we can then define our entire deployment process in code, and we can live in the environment that we're happy with, perhaps as a developer in VS Code. And so, yeah, I think that was absolutely excellent. So I think at this point we should have a look and see if there are any questions. Let's have a look at that.
Sounds great.
So yeah, there's a couple of questions that we've got here. We've got an anonymous question saying, can you deploy to Google Cloud SQL? Actually, there's two questions in one here. We absolutely can. And in fact, if you go to samples.octopus.app, and you look for the pattern rolling space there, you'll see an example of how we can deploy to Google Cloud MySQL. In that case, that's I'm assuming MySQL is the flavor that you're interested in there. But if not, then it'll give you a good idea of how to do that. And then the second question we've got onto that is, how do we deploy to SaaS without a tentacle? That's a really good question, and it's sort of topping out my experience level, but it depends on what you're trying to do. But if you're using the cloud instance, for instance, then you can use something called workers. I think you're talking about Google, but in the case of Azure, I know you can deploy to, say, a web app out there directly using the built-in workers in the cloud instance. So you wouldn't need a tentacle elsewhere. You can deploy out just using whatever API integration is given to you as part of that, or with ARM templates and Bicep templates and things like that as well. So I'm sorry if that doesn't completely answer your question, and do get in touch if it doesn't. I'm more than happy to reach out and talk to you in a bit more detail about that.
Yeah, and just to add a bit more onto that as well, just from the GitHub side. again, there's actions for Google Cloud on the GitHub Actions side as well. And the question that you mentioned about SaaS in particular, just to echo what Pete said, I think really worthwhile just understanding that use case in a bit more depth, because you wouldn't be able to install tentacles, for example, in PaaS services if you're running a software as a service based on PaaS. Typically you have that installed on an infrastructure as a service, some kind of VM, etc. To Pete's point about app service, for example. So it feels like it's maybe more of an application design question. So yeah, be interested to hear more on that.
Yeah, I agree. And actually, there's a follow-on question to that. Would it be possible to deploy to Octopus Deploy by pulling data from GitHub Actions when Octopus Deploy server version is installed behind a firewall? So yeah, that's one for both of us, that one.
Yeah. So I think in a nutshell, what it's the question's asking there, if I extrapolate it away from kind of the specifics, if I'm working with something on premises and I want to use GitHub Actions to talk to that thing on premises, how does that work? Which is a great question, because obviously, you've got this publicly hosted platform. How do I communicate to my instance, which is in an on-premises world? Well, you've got two types of agents that you can run with GitHub Actions. You've got the GitHub managed runners, which are the ones you can just use out of the box, don't really need any setup. They've got tools installed by default, Linux, Mac OS, and Windows. Or you can do self-hosted runners. So that would be a runner which is hosted inside of your environment, and one which effectively then is within your security boundary. Now, both of those you could make work. If you could get access to the IP address ranges of the GitHub hosted runners and allow list that IP range, then you could allow the traffic into your network. But for obvious reasons, that's probably going to be an approach that might not fly with security, for example, because you're suddenly opening a big hole in your network perimeter there. So instead, what I've seen as a very common approach with this and with Azure DevOps is having a agent or the runner which is hosted in your on-premises environment, which has that line of sight, has that ability to communicate internally. So as a result, you don't need to worry about that external firewall then instead. So really having that agent and that worker that is inside the boundary that you can control, no longer have to worry about the firewalls there.
Yeah, it's good. Obviously, we've got the theory of tentacles as well that can run, and then we just open up a socket to the tentacle that way. So we can run behind firewalls that way as well. It's a really good question, actually. And yeah, again, if you need to dive in a bit more, then please do get in touch, and we can talk in a bit more detail about that. Shyam's asked a question. I'm new to Octopus. Is it possible to have two different projects with single server license? That's kind of a little bit out of my scope of knowledge. That's almost a sales question, that one. But my understanding is absolutely. But I'd need to double check that one, Shyam. So there's going to be a couple of email addresses I'll give at the end, and they're definitely the best place to ask that exact sort of question. I wouldn't want to give you some wrong information there. So yeah, feel free to get in touch with that one. And thanks for the question. And then Daniel Westerdale has got some awesome questions over in the community Slack as well. So thanks for those. I think the majority of these are for you, actually, Chris. So what is the cost of Codespaces, and is it a feature of GitHub Enterprise?
Yeah, good question. So GitHub Codespaces, the pricing model, I can share some links to that, is probably best because, pricing can always change, right? So that's why I'd rather share a link than say something in a recording and then it changes.
Likewise.
Or whatever. So I'll put the link in the chat, and you can share that on as well, Pete. But it depends on which kind of what SKU you pick of Codespaces, because you have different kind of number of cores, amounts of RAM that you can put there as well. And then it's charged on a per hour basis of activity. Then you pay for the Codespace storage when it's inactive then as well. Currently only available through GitHub Enterprise and GitHub Teams SKUs. I know there's a lot of interest in terms of like the open source world as well. And I think it's still in beta on that side of things from memory, but it is available as part of GitHub Enterprise, exactly. I'll drop that link into the chat right now.
Fantastic, thank you. And then another one. Can we get the GitHub action to prompt the user to say enter release information and send emails or approval workflows? So sort of, an action that can do like a manual intervention step almost, and then some action after that.
Yeah, it's not quite a manual intervention because you're also having to have that interaction as well. And typically your DevOps workflows run in a headless way. It's a good question. Off the top of my head, nothing springs to mind. But my question would be, what would be manual about that process, and really kind of challenging, is there something you can automate as part of that? If it's a branch ID, for example, or something that is maybe in code somewhere, can you extract that out somehow using code? Can you programmatically get access to that variable in some way? Having said all of that, one of the things worth keeping an eye on would be the GitHub roadmap as well. I know we had a question in the earlier webinar we had this morning on the roadmap. Worth keeping an eye on that because I think they keep up to date the GitHub Actions features and roadmap items as well. So I'll put a link to that in the chat as well, just because that might be relevant.
In Octopus Deploy, we can absolutely do those things, and I'm guessing we can do it in GitHub Actions in an automated way. Exactly. I think obviously in GitHub Actions you could grab the check-in either in the PR or the actual check-in. You can grab the details of that, and you could then build that into that workflow there somehow. And likewise in Octopus Deploy, we can send out emails as a step, and that's something that people do on a regular occasion.
Yep.
And so again, the combination of these two products together can answer questions that your particular workflow will require. So those sorts of things. And again, it sort of just speaks to the story we were talking about under those circumstances. So I quite like that. And then finally, Daniel, and thank you so much for all these questions. These are fantastic. Does config as code replace the process steps you manually set up in Octopus? Yes, exactly that. So config as code for us is a new feature, and we're really proud of what we've done there. Replacing them isn't probably the right way to think about it, actually. You get to, again, on the same theme, you get to live exactly where you want to. So you can create that entire process using the UI and never even touch config as code, even though it's set up. But you can then likewise flip across to VS Code or wherever you want to live and manually create that process in there, or modify steps and check that process in that OCL file in then, and that's reflected back in the UI. So these two things work together, which makes us quite unique in config as code, because a lot of other providers will make you choose. You either get YAML or the UI and not the two things together. So it works really nicely for that, and something that I think is super powerful, because obviously we have diverse teams these days. We have folks who prefer the UI and folks who prefer, like myself, to be a developer and live in something like VS Code. So replace, no, augment and work differently, I would say, would be a better way of thinking about it. So I hope that helps. And I see that you've responded in the Slack channel there. So again, thank you very much for that. So actually, that's all the questions we've got. So I appreciate everybody coming along and taking part. I've got some more slides just to go through at the end. So I mentioned there to Shyam in response to his question that you can absolutely go ahead and talk to our customer success team if you'd like to become an Octopus customer. So that's customer success at octopus.com. And we offer a free consultancy service to all of our customers. And you can reach out to advice@octopus.com. So Shyam, I'd go ahead and reach out to them and ask that question directly. Or likewise, you can ask that question in the community Slack as well at octopus.com/Slack to join that one. And hopefully those will be able to help you for that. And thanks for your feedback there, Shyam, as well. Really appreciate it. I mentioned right at the very start, we record these sessions and then they will be on YouTube later. So do go ahead and subscribe to our Octopus Deploy YouTube channel at youtube.com/Octopus Deploy. Coming up on the 1st of June, we've got a really interesting Ask Octopus live session with Ryan Rousseau and James Chapmas We're running that twice during the day. That's going to be really interesting and a different flavor to the webinar process, so that you can just come along and ask your questions live. I think we've asked for some questions in advance as well, so that'll be great. Again, the recording, we're going to send that out in an email not long after the session's finished, so you'll have that to watch back. And with that, thanks so much to everybody for coming along, and we'll see you all again soon. And thanks so much for recording this session today with us, Chris. It's been fantastic to work with you on that process. So thank you. And we'll see you all soon. Thanks very much.